All right, great. Well, let's get started. We're going to talk about financial aid and paying for college tonight. So, the number one factor in college affordability is the colleges that your student applies to. So if you have a student who has high financial need and they apply to colleges that don't offer generous need-based aid, then you risk being charged a very high price, and the only way to pay for that is likely to be huge debt. On the other hand, if your student doesn't have a lot of need and they apply only to colleges that don't use merit aid, they're going to end up being charged the full price. And a thing to keep in mind is that commuting to an in-state public college is always affordable, and other in-state publics usually are. So I want to put that in just to remind everyone that there is an affordable path to college for everyone. It may not be the path that you have thought of, but there are colleges that are affordable and they're good colleges with good outcomes. So if the number one factor is which college the student applies to, a secondary but important factor is the FAFSA and the CSS profile. Now, you might be surprised to think of that as a secondary factor because you need to file the FAFSA and the CSS profile in order to maximize your ability to get need-based aid. But the reason I consider that a secondary factor is that by the time your student is applying to colleges, the financial information that's going to determine whether they get need-based aid is pretty much fixed. There's not an awful lot you can do with it. And similarly, grades, test scores, and academic record, those are factors in merit aid. But again, by the time your student applies to college, the die is pretty much cast. So, there might be some changes in senior year, but it's really not going to tip the scales in a major way. A non-factor for most people, or a very minor factor, is outside scholarships. So a lot of people say, well, college is expensive, but we're going to apply for scholarships and reduce the costs that way or get some money to pay for it that way. Unfortunately, that usually is not going to be a big factor in affordability. The vast majority of money to pay for colleges comes from colleges themselves. So that's kind of the overview. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. When you're thinking about the cost of college, you want to focus on what's called the net price. That's the true cost of college. Now, people, when they think about the cost of college, tend to focus on the sticker price or the list price. At USM, that's about 25,000. At Wheaton in Massachusetts, it's 77. At Bowdoin, it's about 80,000. And at Boston College, it's about 84,000. However, colleges award a significant amount of gift aid that reduces the cost of college. And when you subtract the gift aid from the sticker price, the result is the net price. That's the true cost of college. Now, colleges often report what's called the average net price for aided students. So at USM, that's about 12,000 a year. Wheaton is 32, Bowdoin is 23, and BC is 33. However, not all students receive gift aid. And in fact, at Bowdoin, only 52% of the students receive gift aid. That means that 48% of the students, or almost half, are paying that full sticker price to go to Bowdoin. And at Boston College, 58% of the students are paying that full $84,000 a year price. So when you think about the average net price for all students, including those who are paying the full price, the actual average is about 13,000 at USM, 33,000 at Wheaton, 51,000 at Bowdoin, and 62,000 at Boston College. So the point of this is it doesn't matter what colleges charge, What matters is what you pay. And what you pay is your net price. That's the college's starting cost or cost of attendance minus the amount of gift aid you might receive at that college. So let's talk about the types of financial aid. And there are basically two categories. The first is gift aid. That's what we've just been talking about. That's free money that reduces the cost of college. And there are two main types of gift aid. One of them is need-based aid, and that's typically called a grant. The other is merit aid, and that's typically called a scholarship. The other category of financial aid is self-help. This does not reduce the cost of college, but it does help you manage how you pay for it. So one category of self-help is work study. That's money that the student gets during the academic year. And the other is loans, money that you borrow to pay the bill, but it has to be repaid after college with interest. So when you think about financial aid in these terms, it's pretty clear that gift aid is more valuable, and that's what you really want to focus on. Unfortunately, colleges don't necessarily make that easy. So colleges will typically notify you how much financial aid you're being offered on what's called an award letter. And this example of an award letter shows $22,000 in financial aid. But when you break it down, it turns out that 4 of the 7 line items are gift aid. 2 of the lines are for loans, and 1 of them is work study. So when you subtotal those different categories, it turns out that the gift aid is about 15,000, loans are 5,500, and work study is 1,800. Now 15,000 is a lot of money, but it's not nearly as much as 22,000. And there's some important information missing, including the list price or the starting cost and your true cost or net price after subtracting your gift aid from the starting cost. I went online and I looked it up, and it turns out that the starting cost at this college was just under 50,000 a year. When you subtract about 15,000 in gift aid, that means that the net price for 1 year for this student at this college was $34,865. Now keep that number in mind. We're going to return to it toward the end of the presentation. But before that, let's dive more deeply into gift aid. So there are two types of gift aid. One of them is need-based aid, which is typically called a grant, and that's based on family income and assets. And this is what people typically think of when they think about financial aid. You apply for federal student loans and for gift aid at all U.S. colleges using the FAFSA. There's an additional financial aid application called the CSS profile, and that's required for college-funded gift aid at about 160 colleges. So that's a minority of the number of total colleges, but they tend to be the most well-known and they tend to be the ones that are most generous with need-based aid. So as your student is going through the applying for college process, there's a good chance you'll encounter both the FAFSA and the CSS profile. The other type of gift aid is merit aid or scholarships, and this is typically based on things like grades, test scores, class rank, recommendations, and so on. And this is often awarded automatically when your student is offered admission to a college with no separate application required. So the college may send a letter saying, congratulations, you've been we want to offer you admission to our college, and we want to offer you X amount of dollars per year in a scholarship. Sometimes, though, there are some limited option scholarships or some limited availability scholarships that do require an additional application. So once your student finalizes the list of schools that they're applying to, you want to spend some time on the financial aid pages of each of those schools to make sure you know how to qualify for as much financial aid as possible. So we're going to focus first on need-based aid. And eligibility for need-based grants is based on a formula that defines financial need as COA minus SAI or EFC. So I'm going to break those down in a moment, but the key thing to remember about need is it's the potential eligibility. It's the maximum amount of need-based aid your student might possibly get. It's not the amount that a college is going to offer. So COA stands for cost of attendance. That's that sticker price we were talking about. And that always includes tuition and fees. It also includes room and board, so a dorm and a meal plan. It includes miscellaneous expenses for books that the student's going to need for his or her classes, and then transportation back and forth to campus and other miscellaneous expenses. SAI stands for Student Aid Index, and that's the result of the filing the FAFSA. The EFC is the expected family contribution, and that comes after you file the CSS profile. But they both work the same way. Subtracting the SAI from the COA gives you the maximum amount of aid you might be eligible for based on the FAFSA. Subtracting the EFC from the cost of attendance gives you the maximum eligibility for need-based aid based on the CSS profile. Key point, college aid policies vary, ranging from colleges with no need-based aid to colleges that award full need based on the FAFSA SAI or the profile EFC. And to keep things in perspective, it's helpful to think about the median income in the United States. It's about $81,000 for a household. And the median wealth for US families is about $177,000. What that means is that half of the families have income or wealth below those numbers. Half the families in the US have income or wealth above them. And it's people in the lower half of those economic ranges who really get the lion's share of need-based aid. Now, if your income or assets happens to be more than that, that doesn't mean that you won't get need-based aid, but it's likely that you might not get as much as you might hope for. So once a college determines what your need is, what that maximum amount of need-based aid that you might get, colleges have four options of what they can do. They can meet some or all of the need with a loan. They can meet some or all of the need with work study. They can meet some or all of the need with gift aid. That's what we want. Or they can fail to meet some of the need. And that means that they leave a gap. There's a portion of your need that is not met with any type of financial aid. So I'm going to show you several examples of how colleges meet need. And for each example, I'm assuming an SAI and an EFC of 30,000. So at Cornell, their starting cost is about 93,000 a year. This family, the student has an SAI and an EFC of 30,000, meaning that the financial need is $63,000. Well, Cornell is going to meet the first $4,000 of need with a loan. Next, they're going to meet the next $5,000 of need with a work-study job. And after subtracting the amount that they've offered in loans and work-study from the total amount of need, anything that's left, which in this case is $53,500, is going to be met with gift aid, a grant. Now, Cornell meets full need. They have no gap. They've met the full amount of need with a combination of loans, work study, and gift aid or grant. The grant of $53,500 subtracted from the starting cost of attendance of $92,500 means that the net price for this student for 1 year at Cornell is $39,000, about $9,000 more than the EFC. Bowdoin is another college that meets full financial need, but they actually have a more generous need-based aid program than Cornell does. So the cost at Bowdoin is similar, about $94,000. When you subtract the EFC of $30,000, there's $64,000 of need. Bowdoin gives no loans in their standard financial aid package. They do expect the student to take a work-study job for $2,400, but that means that their gift aid is $61,500, significantly more than Cornell's. And the net price at Bowdoin, after subtracting gift aid from the cost, is $32,400. So this student who has exactly the same EFC gets a significantly lower cost at Bowdoin because Bowdoin has a different approach to how it awards need-based aid. I'm going to show you a few examples of some colleges that don't use the CSS profile. These colleges use the FAFSA only. So at Bryant, this student with a 30,000 SAI has $46,000 of need. Bryant's going to offer a loan of $5,500, work study of $2,000, gift aid or grant of $23,000, but there's still a gap, some unmet need that amounts to about $15,000. And the net price at Bryant is $53,000. University of New Hampshire is similar. University of Wisconsin in Madison has a starting cost of $65,000 with a 30,000 SAI. That means the student has $35,000 in need. Wisconsin is going to offer an out-of-state student loans and work study, but no gift aid. The full remaining amount of need is gapped, and the net price at University of Wisconsin is $64,800, exactly the same as their cost of attendance because they've offered no gift aid. So this is why I say that where you apply to college is critical. This student has exactly the same economic profile and eligibility for aid at each of those schools, but you can see that the true net price is very, very different. So we said that the EFC or the SAI determines eligibility for need-based aid. There are two formulas, one based on the SAI, on the FAFSA, and one based on the CSS profile, but they both use the same basic approach. And that is to look at the income and assets of the parents and the student. Now, most people find that parent income is the biggest driver of the EFC because once you reach a relatively low level of income, every additional dollar of income increases the EFC by 47 cents. That means you reduce eligibility for need-based aid by 47 cents. On the other hand, assets contribute a maximum of 5 to 5.64%. So once you reach a relatively low level of assets, each additional dollar of assets adds only about a nickel to the EFC and reduces eligibility by only about a nickel. Most high school students don't have a significant portion that comes from income. However, if a student happens to have assets in his or her name, that has a much bigger impact on the EFC and reduces eligibility for aid more than it would if that were a parent asset. It turns out that there is a loophole, and if you put student-owned assets into a student-owned 529 account, they're going to be counted as parent assets. So if a student happens to have $10,000 in his or her name, that's going to reduce eligibility for aid by $2,000 to $2,500. If you put it into a custodial 529, it's going to reduce eligibility for aid by only about $500. So there's a savings of $1,500 to $2,000 in the EFC and increased eligibility for aid of $1,500 to $2,000. So let's talk about the FAFSA and what it's used for. The FAFSA's primary purpose from the federal government standpoint is to award federal Pell Grants. These are federal grants that go to the neediest students only. So typically, if the family income is under $30,000 to $40,000, those are going to be the strongest candidates for Pell Grants. Most state need-based grants also use the FAFSA for determining eligibility. And federal work study is a need-based program, and so that's typically also based on the FAFSA. However, most colleges, even if a student doesn't technically qualify for work study based on the FAFSA, often will have campus jobs available for students. So even if you don't qualify based on the FAFSA, it's likely that your student will be able to get some type of campus employment. Federal student loans are available to all students who file the FAFSA as long as they're citizens or green card holders, regardless of need. So my kid is eligible for federal student loans. Bill Gates's kids are eligible as long as they file the FAFSA. And at colleges that don't use the CSS profile, the FAFSA may be used to award college-funded grants. However, as we've seen at Bryant and University of New Hampshire, colleges that don't use the profile tend not to be as generous with college-funded grants, and they often leave a gap between the amount of aid they offer and the amount of need that a student has. So that's what the FAFSA is for. How about the profile? That's used for awarding college-funded need-based grants. And most generous need-based aid is from profile colleges. At those profile colleges, the maximum annual aid based on the FAFSA is about $7,000 to $10,000, while the aid based on the profile could be as much as $80,000 or $90,000 per year. Many profile colleges give a discount if there happen to be two students in college at the same time. And almost all of the colleges that say they meet full financial need use the CSS profile. Now, a couple of other terms you may hear. Need blind. These are colleges that claim not to consider need when they're making their admission decision. The alternative is need aware. These are colleges that meet full need, but they might give an admission advantage to students who can pay the full cost of attendance. So a lot of people ask me, well, maybe I shouldn't file the FAFSA and the profile because maybe my student might have a little bit more of a chance for admission if I don't apply for need-based aid. And there's a kernel of truth to that. There is a little bit of an advantage for some students who can pay the full cost of attendance. However, if you really need need-based aid, you don't want your student to be admitted and be expected to pay a price you can't afford. So I always recommend that people file the FAFSA and the profile. Almost all colleges that don't meet full need are need blind because after all, if you don't meet full need, it's easy to be need blind. So let's compare the FAFSA and the profile. The FAFSA looks at income and assets. For income, they start with adjusted gross income from the tax return, and then they add some items of income that are not subject to tax, but are included in the financial aid formula. And the most common for most people is an IRA, a SEP contribution, or a simple contribution that you've deducted on your 1040. For assets, the FAFSA is going to look at checking and savings accounts, investment accounts like mutual funds and brokerage accounts, real estate other than the primary residence, so second homes or vacation homes, 529s for which the student is a beneficiary. And when you consider the value of assets, what you want to, or what they're looking at is the market value of the asset minus any debt directly secured by the asset. So if you happen to have an investment real estate property that has a mortgage on it, they're going to be looking at the market value less the amount of the mortgage that secures that property. And important to be aware, retirement accounts and personal property are not included. The profile is going to look at all of the income that the FAFSA looks at, plus they're going to look at additional retirement contributions from the W-2 that aren't reported on the 1040. Those include 401k and 403b contributions. And if you've been allowed to deduct tax losses or depreciation from a small business on your 1040, profile colleges will typically add that back as untaxed income. The profile is going to look at all of the assets that the FAFSA looks at, plus the profile will also look at home equity in the family's primary residence and 529s in the names of the student's siblings, family businesses and farms, other assets in the siblings' names, and so on. Once again, though, retirement accounts and personal property are not included for the profile, same as the FAFSA. There have been a few changes to the federal financial aid rules recently. The FAFSA used to offer a discount when there were multiple siblings in college at the same time. That has been eliminated. In cases where the parents are divorced, the FAFSA used to look at which parent the student lived with more of the time. Now that has changed, and it's the parent who contributes the greater share of the student's expenses. Federal undergraduate loans were not changed with the Trump tax law that passed this year, but there was a limit imposed on Parent Plus loans. That limit is a maximum of $20,000 per year and $65,000 total per student. In addition, the Trump tax bill limited loans that are available for graduate programs. So we're focusing tonight on college, but if your student is thinking about graduate school after college, you should be aware that the amount that they might be able to borrow for graduate school could be limited. There are some special cases that we should talk about. So we talked a little bit about divorced and separated parents. The FAFSA includes only one biological parent. That's the one who contributed the greater portion of the student's expenses. And if that parent has remarried, they will also look at the income and assets of the new spouse. The profile looks at both biological parents, and if those parents have remarried, they'll also look at the new spouses. So the profile might be looking at the income and assets of as many as 4 different parents and step-parents. Now, the profile does have a calculation that goes on in the background that's intended to put the primary burden on the biological parents. But that formula is imperfect, and so it's often a disadvantage for financial aid if the parents have remarried. So remarry for love, don't remarry for financial aid. Another thing to be aware of, the FAFSA and the profile are looking at income that was earned in the past. However, your income may have changed. Your circumstances may have changed after the income year that they're looking at. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe there's been a death in the family or something like that. In that case, you want to report the numbers as they're being asked, so as they were during that year that's being looked at, but then you want to contact the financial aid office of each college that your student is applying to and say, hey, look, I reported the information from such and such a time period, but my circumstances have changed. Can you evaluate me for more financial aid? Another thing is negotiation. Sometimes you might get offers from more than one college, and it's perfectly legitimate to go back to college A, who hasn't offered as much aid, show them the offer from college B, and say, can you do a little bit better? Colleges may or may not be willing to adjust their offer, but you have nothing to lose by asking. Another thing to keep in mind, early decision is often a disadvantage for financial aid. That's because when you apply early decision, you're making a commitment that if the college admits the student and offers enough aid to make it affordable, that you will withdraw your applications from all other schools and commit to that college. So you won't have the ability to compare competing financial aid offers. And so you may have less leverage if you were going to try to negotiate. So be aware of that if your student is considering early decision. So we said that the FAFSA and the profile are looking at income that was earned in the past. So for students who are current high school seniors and will graduate in the class of 2026, the FAFSA and profile are going to be asking about income that was earned in calendar year 2024. So that's the year that ended this past December 31st. You filed your taxes April 15th. Your student is probably getting ready to apply to college now in the fall, and you'll be able to file the FAFSA and the profile at the same time that your student is applying for admission. That way, the colleges, when they offer the student admission, will also be able to tell you how much financial aid you might be awarded. So that's what they're looking at for income. For assets, they're looking at assets as of the date that you file the financial aid forms. So if your student is applying in the fall of 2025, that's probably when you're going to file the financial aid forms. And here, there is a little bit that you can do to possibly make yourself eligible for a little bit more need-based aid. So we said that assets do count in the formula. If you have an expense that you know you need to make, for example, if you're self-employed and you pay estimated taxes, you might want to make that payment a little bit early, because that way, when you file the FAFSA, it won't be in your checking account, and you might potentially qualify for a little bit more need-based aid. So this is a table that describes or that shows you which income years are going to be looked at for current high school seniors. So for the first year of college, they're going to be looking at 2024. The second year will be 2025, the third year 26, and the fourth year 27. This also offers potentially another opportunity for planning if your student might be eligible for need-based aid. It turns out that if the student is fortunate enough to have grandparents who want to help pay for college, at CSS profile schools, those grandparent payments are considered income to the student. But if you wait until after January 1st of the student's sophomore year of college, the final income year for the FAFSA and the profile will have finished. And so you might want to wait until after that time for those grandparents to be made if your student might qualify for need-based aid. If your student won't qualify for need-based aid, then you don't need to worry about that. So for people who have younger students, here's a similar table for juniors, sophomores, and ninth graders. So let's say that you think that you might have financial need and you'd like to find colleges that might meet that need. Well, what you want to do, of course, is to find colleges that are going to meet a significant portion of that need with gift aid and hopefully not leave a gap in the amount of need that they offer. So if your student applies to Orono or University of New Hampshire, they meet 50% and 37% of need with gift aid, and they have gaps of 26 to 29%. Now, that's not great need-based aid. The University of Maine is probably going to be affordable, but that's because of their lower starting cost, not because of a generous need-based aid program. At NYU and Ohio Wesleyan, the portion of need met with grants is a little better, and the amount of the gap is not as great. So it's possible that those might be candidates, although they're not the best on need-based aid. At colleges like BU and Bowdoin, that's when those colleges are meeting a substantial portion of need with gift aid and relatively smaller gaps. And in fact, Bowdoin is kind of the gold standard of a college with a fabulous need-based aid program. So if your student has financial need, there's a good chance that Bowdoin is going to offer a generous financial aid award. Of course, the trick is that Bowdoin is very difficult for admission. So if you're not admitted, that's not going to help. So let's say that you have financial need, you've identified a college that might offer need-based aid. Will that need-based aid make college affordable? So this is an example of Carleton College. They're a generous college in Minnesota. They meet full financial need. And in this example, their cost of attendance is a little under 90,000 and the EFC is 30,000. So there's about $60,000 of financial need. Well, in year one, Carleton is going to offer $4,500 of loan, $3,100 of work study, and a grant of $52,000. Carleton is a full need college, so there's no gap. When you subtract the gift aid from the cost of attendance, the net price is about $38,000, so about $8,000 more than the EFC. This pattern continues in years 2, 3, and 4. Carleton asks a little bit more in terms of a loan each of those years, but at the end of 4 years, Carleton has met full need using grants, loans, and work study. The amount of the combined EFC for all 4 years is 120,000. The net price is 156,000, so about $36,000 more than the EFC. So the rule of thumb I use is if the EFC times 4 plus about $40,000 is not affordable, then need-based aid may not be the answer to your paying for college plan. So if need-based aid isn't going to be the answer, you might want to think about merit aid. And to talk about merit aid, we really need to start by talking about the business of college. So students and families tend to focus on the acceptance rate when they think about different colleges. That's the percent of students who apply to college in the fall or the winter and who are offered admission in the spring. At Harvard, it's 4%. BU and USC are close to 10%, but Muhlenberg, Ohio Wesleyan, and University of Denver are well above 50%. Colleges pay attention to the admit rate, but they also focus on the yield rate. That's the percent of students who are offered admission in the spring and who enroll in the fall. So at Harvard, more than 4 out of 5 students who are offered admission end up going there. At Muhlenberg, Ohio Wesleyan, and University of Denver, it's 15% or less. Now, when that yield rate gets below 20, 25%, colleges really worry about having enough students coming in the fall to contribute some tuition revenue to help them pay their bills. So what do? They put themselves on sale with financial aid in order to compete for yield. So the third column is the percent of students at each of these schools that receive college-funded gift aid. It might be need-based aid or it might be merit aid, but it's college-funded gift aid that reduces the cost. And the fourth column is the percent of students with no financial need who receive merit aid. And you can see that at Muhlenberg, Ohio Wesleyan, and University of Denver, almost every single student gets some type of college-funded gift aid. almost no one is paying the full price at those schools. So that's a pretty good indication that those schools are using merit aid. So we said that merit aid is typically called a scholarship. The factors that go into it are things like grades, class rank, test scores. It's most common at private colleges, but more and more public colleges are using merit aid too. And here's a key point. The highest awards go to the strongest students relative to the other applicants at that college. What that means is that your student might get their highest merit offers at what they might think of as their safer or target schools. So a safety school for admission might also be a safety school for financial aid. And as with need-based aid, college aid policies vary, ranging from colleges that use no merit aid to colleges that use primarily merit aid. And above all, it's a way for colleges to fill their unsold seats. So I'm going to show you some examples of how colleges award merit aid. These are from before the pandemic, when the use of SATs in admission was more universal. And what you can see is that at each of these schools, the highest merit awards go to students who are in the upper 25% of the SAT range at that particular school. And the lower merit awards are very close to the lower 25% of students at those schools. It turns out that you can make a pretty good generalization from that observation, which is that if a college uses merit aid, the best chances for the largest awards are when you're above the college's 75th percentile, when you're in the top quarter of applicants to that school. If colleges use merit aid, the awards may phase out when you get to about the college's 25th percentile. But at colleges that compete aggressively for students, they may offer merit aid to nearly everyone. So let's say you wanted to identify some colleges that use merit aid. How might you do it? Well, it turns out that merit aid is highly correlated to the percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid. The best chance for a large award is when the admit rate is relatively high, the yield rate is relatively low, the percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid is relatively high, and the student is a strong applicant at that college. Many colleges award gift aid to 100% of the students. No one pays the full price. And when that percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid is 80% or higher, there's a very strong prospect for merit aid. And there are hundreds of colleges that have gift aid, that the percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid is 90% or more. So how can you identify that? Well, here is an example of a couple of resources, and I'm going to use Clark University in Worcester as an example. So what we want to first do is look at Clark and find out the percent of students at Clark who receive college-funded gift aid. This is a fabulous website with a lot of data about colleges. I'm checking the financial aid section, and here I find that 97% of the students at Clark receive college-funded gift aid. Only 3% of the students there are paying the full price. Now I want to guess what the amount of the merit aid might be and what the net price might be. So I'm going to go to the College Board's Big Future website. Once again, I'm going to look up Clark, and what it's going to show is that the average amount of non-need-based aid, in other words, merit aid, is a little under $21,000 per year. So I subtract 21,000 from the college's starting cost of 69, and if I got an average merit award at Clark, my net price might be about $48,000. So if that's closer to my budget for college, that might be a good option for me. So here are some examples of some specific colleges. If your student is applying to Boston College, don't plan on merit aid. They award college-funded gift aid only to 42% of students. Very few students receive college-funded non-need gift aid. At George Washington and Macalester, there's a much better prospect of getting some type of merit award. And at Allegheny and Denver, there's a very high likelihood. At public colleges, it's a similar pattern. At Berkeley and University of Wisconsin, don't expect any merit aid. But at UMass Amherst, University of Montana, or University of Vermont, there's a pretty good chance. And at UVM, in fact, a very good chance that your student might be offered merit aid. So if the applicant is competitive and the percent of students receiving college-funded aid is over 80%, merit aid is possible. If it's over 90%, it's probable. So I want to show you kind of a summary of how colleges award aid. And I'm going to break these down into 4 categories that I call the elite and near elite, the mid-market, and others. Those elite and near elite colleges have generous need-based aid programs in general. They often meet full need and meet a very substantial portion of it with grants. But they tend to use little or no merit aid. There are probably 150 or so colleges in those categories. There are about 2,000 colleges in the mid-market and other category. Those colleges tend not to have great need-based aid, but they often have very significant merit aid. So if your student has high financial need, looking at those elite and near elite colleges might be a good idea. If your student doesn't, looking at the mid-market and other colleges might help. So we've talked about need-based aid, we've talked about merit aid. If you want to estimate your cost, you can use a tool called a net price calculator. Now, net price calculators are required by law, and the law requires them to show the starting price, that cost of attendance, an estimate of the gift aid, and the net price. But just because colleges are required to have a net price calculator doesn't mean they're required to have a good one. So here's how you can tell the difference. If a net price calculator is super easy to use, it asks 5 or 6 questions, it probably stinks. If it has a lot of questions, if it's really digging into the information, then it's probably asking for enough information to give you a pretty reliable estimate of the net price. And I use these all the time, and I find that they're often quite helpful and reasonably reliable. So once you check net price calculators, that's going to enable you to compare the price side by side. And here's where I want to pause for a minute, because we've been talking about dollars and cents all evening. But there is more to college than that. You want to make sure that your student has a good environment which they'll thrive, that they'll be able to take the majors that they want. So I'm not advocating that you find the cheapest possible college, but what I am advocating for is that you find a college where both you and your student will be in a good position at the end of 4 years to move on with the other goals that you have in life. And by a good position, I mean not burdened by too much debt. So I'm going to show you some examples of net prices using net price calculators. This is for a student with an EFC of 15,000, B minus to B grades, and an 1100 SAT. At Roger Williams, their starting cost is about 64,000. They estimate about $22,000 in a merit award, an additional 2,000 in need-based aid for a net price of 40,000. At Shenandoah in Virginia, the net price is 37,000. It's 35,000 at Wheaton, 30,000 or less at Orono. At Bowdoin, it's 17,000. That's only 2,000 more than the EFC, so that's a great price. And then at USM, if you live with your parents at home and commute, the net price is about $16,000 a year. So a couple of things to point out. First of all, I know that living with your parents and commuting to USM is not an apples to apples experience to going away to college and living in the dorm. But the reason I put that example on is to remind people there is an affordable path to college for everyone, and far better to make some compromises during the 4 years of college so that you get the benefit of a degree and not have 20, 30, 40 years after college where you're struggling with unsustainable debt. The other thing to point out, a B-minus student is unlikely to get into Bowdoin. So even though that's a great net price, you have to consider it in the context of the admission prospects at a given school. All right, we're closing in on the end. I want to talk a little bit about how you pay the net price. Now, remember, college gift aid is always included in the net price, and other scholarship aid is very rare. The way you pay the net price is from income that you have earned over time. What do I mean by this? Well, there are three sources of income. One is prior income. That's money that you earned in the past and saved. Another is current income. That's money that you earn during the college years and can use to pay college expenses. And then the final one is future income, money that you earn after college and use to repay loans that you took out to pay for college. And that's always the most expensive way to pay for college. So I want to return to that example we looked at the beginning of the evening, where the first year net price was about $35,000. And think about whether this is going to be an affordable 4-year college. So we've got to remember that the cost will continue over 4 years. So we've got to ask, how much will the costs increase? And is the aid renewable and on what terms? That's a very important question. When a college tells you how much financial aid they're offering, if it is not crystal clear exactly what's required to renew the aid and whether the aid is renewable, you want to make sure you find out from the college. Now, typically, merit aid is renewable as long as the student maintains a minimum GPA, and need-based aid is renewable as long as the family's income and assets remain consistent over the college years. But if it's not absolutely clear, make sure you find out. So we're going to assume that the costs increase about 2% a year. The aid is renewable and constant for 4 years. The student has $2,000 in savings and the parents have $25,000 in savings. So let's see how we can pay for this college. So when you extend that $35,000 a year price out over 4 years, it turns out that the total cost of a degree is almost $144,000. I'm going to first look at the student. The student can get a work-study job each year during the academic year and probably make about $2,500 each of the 4 years of college. So over 4 years, that's $10,000. In addition, as long as the student files the FAFSA, they can get federal student loans. But there's a limit to how much the student can borrow. And that limit is $5,500 in the first year of college, $6,500 in the second, and then $7,500 each in years 3 and 4. So that's a total of $27,000 in federal student loans. Next, we're going to use the $2,000 in student savings. Remember, we said that student assets count a little more heavily in the financial aid formulas for need-based aid. So if we use those first, maybe there might be a little bit more eligibility for need-based aid in years 2, 3, and 4. Next, we're going to assume that the student gets a summer job each year before college. And if the student gets a summer job and earns $4,000 to $5,000, they can pay taxes, go to the beach, but they can also save $2,500 each summer for tuition. At this point, we've got to start looking to the parents. And these parents look at their budget and they decide that they can afford $375 a month out of their ongoing income for expense to pay for college during the college years. So multiply that 375 by 12, and that's $4,500 per year. Next, we're going to use about $18,000 of parent savings, and that fully pays for the first year of college. In the second year of college, we're going to use the remaining $7,000 in parent savings. But at this point, the resources are exhausted. The only way to pay for additional college is for there to be additional borrowing. And I always consider any borrowing beyond the $27,000 in federal student loans to be a parent responsibility, because at a minimum, the parents are going to need to co-sign for those loans. So in this example, the parents are going to need to borrow $12,000 to pay for year 2, $19,000 to pay for year 3, and $20,000 to pay for year 4. So at the end of 4 years, we've fully paid for this college degree using prior income, current income, and future income. The student has borrowed $27,000 and the parents have borrowed $52,000. Is that a good idea? We don't know yet. There are some additional questions we need to ask. The first of them is, what will federal loans cost? Well, the current interest rate for student loans is about 6.4%, and for parent loans, it's 8.9%. And those are typically paid off 10 years beginning 6 months after graduation. In addition, the interest clock starts ticking immediately when you take out those loans, but they know you're going to be borrowing during the 4 years of college. So they allow that interest to accumulate during the college years, and then it's added to the beginning balance of the loan when it goes into repayment. So that student who borrowed $27,000 is going to have about $4,500 of interest that accumulates. So that beginning balance is $31,500. Now, for every $1,000 of student debt, the student is going to need to pay about $136 per year for 10 years to pay that off. So if the student has 31.5 thousand, multiply that by 136, that means the student is going to be paying about $4,274 each year to pay off that debt. That's about $356 a month. And the parents are going to be paying $9,300 a year. Is that reasonable? Well, my rule of thumb for students is that their payments for education debt should not exceed about 10% of their gross income after college. So if the student borrows $27,000 and is paying about $4,300 a year, that means the student needs to get a job after college that pays about $43,000 per year. That means the student will be paying about 10% of his or her income for education debt and have 90% for taxes, rent, and everything else. The good news is that new college graduates make about $40,000 to $50,000 a year on average. So it's probably not unreasonable for the student to borrow that $27,000 in return for the benefits that he or she gets from a college degree. For the parents, it's more complicated because they've got to think about their ongoing obligations, college for other children, and retirement. And in this example, I see a big red flag. Because remember, when we talked to the parents, they said they could afford $375 a month or $4,500 a year out of their ongoing income. So my question to them is going to be, If you can afford $4,500 a year to pay for college during the college years, what makes you think you can all of a sudden go to $9,300 a year to pay for college after the college years? So to me, this does not look like an affordable option. So how does everyone else pay? Exactly the way I've been describing to you tonight. You want to start with the cost of attendance, subtract the amount of gift aid, think about that over 4 years, and that's the net price or the true cost of a college degree. Next, you want to think about the resources you have to pay the net price. Now, I think that students automatically have $47,000. That's $2,500 a year in summer job earnings, $2,500 a year in work study times 4 years, plus the $27,000 in federal student loans. Any additional parent savings or income that parents can pay out of their ongoing income for college is going to make up the balance of the resources that are available. And if those resources don't equal the net price of a college degree, there's a gap. And the only way to fill that gap is to either take on more debt or find a lower net price. Now, when I work with families, what I want them to do is to think about their zone of affordability. That's looking at that prior income, current income, and future income that people can pay for college and look at it from the point of view of both the student and the parents. So the student, we said, has $47,000. If the student has any savings, that can be added to it. If the parents have savings available for college, that would add to it as well. And if the parents can budget an amount out of their income for college during the college years. Now, I always encourage parents to think about this zone of affordability without any parent debt. The reason is that most parents are going to be in their 50s by the time their kids graduate from college. And if they're paying off debt for 10 years, that means they're going to be in their 60s or maybe pushing 70 by the time they pay off that education debt. And those are years when they really probably want to be thinking about retirement. So if you add up those 5 numbers in that table above, and then compare that to the estimated 4-year cost of a degree, the point where the resources equal the cost is the zone of affordability. And any college at that price or below is in this family's zone of affordability. So this is pretty heavy stuff, and I think it helps to think about it in perspective. And I often think about that in terms of the stages of grief. Now, I'm not really hoping to put anyone in a grief position, but if I do, I would much rather have you go through those stages of grief before your student makes decisions that will put you in an unsustainable position after college. And it's important to remember that college is important, but it's not the goal. The goal is to set your student up for success after college in a way that both the student and the parents are able to move on with their lives and accomplish their other goals without being burdened with unsustainable debt. Another way to keep things in perspective. The guy who built Starbucks into a huge company went to Northern Michigan University. The CEO of Walt Disney went to Ithaca College, and the CEO of GE Aerospace went to Washington College in Maryland. These are all great colleges, but they're not the types of colleges that you typically see on bumper stickers on the back of people's cars. But these people have done just fine. And finally, you can think about the typical earnings. So the typical graduate of Boston College in their mid-career makes about $127,000. The typical graduate of Loyola University in Baltimore makes $1,000 less per year, $126,000. but the difference in the net price is almost $108,000. That means that the BC graduate is going to have to work for 108 years in order to pay off the difference in the net price. And I don't know about you, but that would interfere with my retirement plans. So how can you find financial safeties? You can use the numbers that we've talked about tonight. And I'll be glad to share these slides with everyone. My email will come up in a moment. Kind of a shortcut is to seed the list of colleges that your student applies to so that they've got a wide variety of colleges with different approaches to how they award financial aid. So it always makes sense for students to apply to a public college in their home state. So University of Maine or Farmington. Maybe they think about an out-of-state flagship like UMass Amherst, or they might think about Worcester State. UMass Amherst starts at about 60,000. Worcester State is 35,000, much more affordable. If a student has high financial need, they might want to think about a highly selective private college. And if they're looking for merit aid, there's a group called the Colleges That Change Lives at this web address, and they often use significant amounts of merit aid. And commuting to college is always affordable. Now, for Maine residents, there's an opportunity to get some free money to pay for college. So if you deposit $1,000 into a FAME 529 each year, FAME will give you $300 each year for college. So even if your student is a junior or senior in high school, you could still conceivably get $1,200 or $1,500 to pay for college absolutely free. So I've always been a coupon clipper, and this seems like a pretty good coupon to me. So we're just about done. I have a website that has some resources that could be helpful for you. And I want to thank you all for listening. If you'd like a copy of the slides, be sure to send me an email and I would be glad to send them to you. And I'm going to turn off the recording if I can. Didn't want to do that.